Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Dave Weisberger, the CEO of CoinRoutes. It's Wednesday, June 28th, and I'm filming this because I got incredibly mad listening to the podcast yesterday with Laura Shin as she had Rodrigo and her effectively debating Aaron Kaplan from Prometheum. Mr. Kaplan defined almost a masterclass in how to put out circular arguments and not answer questions in order to stay on message. At the end of the day, what happened in that podcast was, for the discerning listener, was he looked foolish because he was actually saying something that made no sense. But for the non-discerning audience, they would say, well, they didn't get him to admit anything. And that is true because he refuses to answer questions. The reality of what's going on with Prometheum, though, can easily be summed up by circular arguments that start with the assumption that crypto should be banned, starts with the assumption that nothing going on in digital assets has added value, starts with an assumption that the innovations in tokenomics is totally useless and should not be supported to support entrepreneurs, and starts with the assumption that trading in a digital manner is going to be a good thing for the world as we move forward over the next decade or so. So let's talk about his specific arguments. And the first one, which is interesting and radiates throughout the interview, is that Mr. Kaplan believes that the notion of compliance with rules that don't work is protection. But what he's effectively admitted at multiple times is that it would ban the current activities that are going on in the cryptoverse. Let me be very specific as we go through this, as I go through the specifics later. But the most important thing to understand is he admitted that you can't trade against Bitcoin, or you can't trade Bitcoin. You can't trade against Ethereum, although he's not willing to admit that that's not a security because his masters don't want to admit that Ethereum isn't a security. But right now, he wouldn't call it a security. He waves his arms around lots of things as we go through the details. But the truth of the matter is, none of, or the vast majority of volume in the cryptoverse could not trade on his platform, could not trade on any platform in a compliant manner because of the lack of registration of the underlying tokens, who of course can't register, but we'll get to that in a heartbeat. The second thing that came across from this interview is how he sidesteps issues. He sidesteps the inadequacy of disclosures for issuers completely, ignoring the fact that the most important determinants for investors in a token is the tokenomics themselves. Understanding the supply, understanding lockups, understanding whether or not there is a scarcity schedule, understanding what the use case would be, whether tokens will be burned, whether any income will accrue to the tokens, all of those things. None of that is available in the existing disclosure. So even if they did disclose, it would be woefully inadequate to protect investors. Sidesteps it completely. Second thing he sidesteps is the impossibility for open source projects to register and have tokens used for their use case. Now, let me explain things very straightforwardly. If you were starting a token project, and at varying times in CoinRoute's journey, we talked about the idea of using a token. We dismissed it because we're a software company and didn't need a native token, and we did all our development in-house. But let's say you want to encourage open source developers in order to contribute to your platform. What is the best way to do that? Well, it's really hard to pay them, because how could you pay them? You have to evaluate what's going on. But what you can do is incentivize open source developers with a native token that will contribute to the ecosystem. At the same time, you can incentivize users of the network to use your token, to hold the token. And some platforms, what they do is they airdrop tokens to concerned users, and then they have an incentive to help build the network. All of that type of incentive structures for open source requires a free ability for tokens to be sold or given as incentives, and then that token to have the ability to have a value. Well, there is no way to do that in U.S. securities laws. He talked about it and waved his arms around it, but it requires tokens to exist for over a year for a seasoning period. It was discussed under Rule 144 when he talked about it, but what is not clear is that there's no way to distinguish if you are an open trading platform between tokens that were seasoned and ones that were not. It has to be a closed platform. So you can't have an open source, open platform trading tokenomics under the way Rule 144A does, because almost all of the investors that would be incentivized in this case are not accredited investors, and accredited investors are the only ones who can freely trade private securities. So what does this mean? He has sidestepped that issue. It is a big issue. It is one that I personally have talked to many founders about over the 6 years that we've been building CoinRoutes. And the truth of the matter is there is no good answer in the US. That is why people do not even try to register their tokens as securities in the US, because it will be a non-starter. But of course, when he says, well, there's a compliant way to do it, it's a compliant way to ban it. And that's the activity he's looking for. The other thing that really struck me is how he deflects on multiple issues. When asked specifically about this tokenomics question, he then jumped into a defense of fair and orderly markets. But he deflects the inadequacy of the analog market structure for digital assets. Understand something, that Prometheum does not and cannot allow on-demand settlement. He deflected on that as well, but considering existing laws require paper confirms to be sent out in batch, there's no way to allow on-demand settlement, and there are many other rules and reasons why you can't do that. Which basically means nobody who's doing a peer-to-peer transaction can interface with the platform. It also cannot allow multi-currency trading, not dollars, pounds, yen, euro, but also not, by definition, against stable coins or Bitcoin or Ethereum, which comprises a significant amount of the total crypto ecosystem. So effectively, most of the volume that trades in crypto cannot trade on this platform, isn't fungible, and is much less efficient. Lastly, the fungibility is a big deal. It also preserves what is a very inefficient problem that crypto solves, which is geographical fragmentation. If you want to give rent-seeking firms, such as banks, to allow U.S. firms trading in foreign securities have to be ADRs or gray market situations, which are many percentage points of excess cost. That is one thing. But if you look at it from the rest of the world trading in U.S. securities, they have to do GDRs or they can't trade them at all. And so creating a global capital market, which is what the crypto digital market structure allows, is completely impossible in his way. Now, I'm sure what he would say is, well, we'll walk, crawl, run, and we'll get there eventually. But the eventually requires new rules. The existing rules don't work. And unfortunately, masked within the rhetoric is that simple fact that new rules are required. Now, honestly, we know that is true, even though he never wants to admit it. The last point, which I really couldn't stand, is he makes this claim that the ATS system creates automatically fair and orderly markets because, well, that's what the regulations say. But it's complete nonsense that we have perfect markets with ATSs that are not linked to other ATSs. In fact, if you look at ongoing market structure debates, you'll know that there are many people out there who believe the current US market structure is way overly fragmented and doesn't need in a needless sense. But let's leave that aside. The one point that is where I agree with Mr. Kaplan on, and this is extremely important, is that good regulations, ones which allowed for a watchdog to check out for best execution, for fiduciary responsibilities, towards investors, for protecting investor assets, for making sure that disclosures are fair, accurate, for making sure that marketing is not hyperbolic or not guaranteeing that it can't, and above all else, understanding and managing conflicts of interest such that firms that do multiple things for customers, that you can understand where those conflicts are, manage where those conflicts are, and properly disclose them. All of that the industry agrees with. Certainly at CoinRoutes, we are massive proponents of thoughtful regulation. Our point, which is the same as McHenry in the Finance Committee and the Agriculture Committee, Congressman Davidson, who was just on our crypto town hall earlier this week, most thoughtful people agree that good regulation would make sense. The reason why Prometheum and Aaron Kaplan's insanely wrong circular reason narrative needs to be debunked is because he's making the argument that we can do it from within the current regulations when we all know that the entire crypto sphere has said, no, they can't operate that way. But what's important, it isn't in all cases. Certainly, there are some people who are charlatans in the crypto space. You might even say the majority of the people and token projects are problematic in the crypto space. But there is a core group of companies and many entrepreneurs who want to do things the right way and simply can't. And that is important. The distinction that I made last week between the Binance case and the Coinbase case is rather stark. There are very serious allegations made about Binance. Now, I have no way to know whether they're accurate or not, but they're serious. But none of the allegations against Coinbase had any investor harm associated with them. Unless, of course, you're like Mr. Kaplan and you believe that every investor who's invested in crypto has lost money, which is demonstrably false. I mean, Bitcoin, for example, is the best performing asset class on virtually any time period one can measure, dating back since its inception. And so banning investors from being able to, in a regulated manner, buy Bitcoin spot based on assuming the SEC had regulation, is not the answer. The core underlying assumption that all investors are harmed is demonstrably false. And that's the point that I wanted to make. So, what is the other major problem here? And I will leave you with this. If you believe that we should not change regulation in the United States, and the Prometheum case is right, and all activity migrates offshore, what happens? Well, two things. First, the US is left out of the digital financial system as it inevitably will overtake the analog financial system. But in the short run, US investors will do everything they can to trade offshore, illegally or not. This is a known behavior, and it is why so many US investors lost money in FTX. FTX did not allow US investors to trade. To do so, they had to jump through hoops. But many US investors lost money there. So that is the inevitable consequence of not regulating intelligently and stonewalling on the issue. And that's why I'm so upset by people giving this person the airtime and the ability to make these arguments without having the answer for the circular reasoning. Okay, this rant is over, but I do want to make one last point. Mr. Kaplan, if you watch this and you're willing to actually have a moderated debate where the only rule other than strict time periods for answering questions is yes or no questions need to be answered with a yes or a no. And there are, yes, we can limit the number of those, but they have to be answerable. As long as you're willing to do that, I am willing to debate you anytime, anywhere, any place on the core business aspects of everything I've just said.